Now we reach the land that Winston Churchill called a riddle wrapped around by a mystery inside an enigma. The one, the only, Russia. Whether of the Soviet or non-Soviet varieties. So in the 1400s, we began the unit with the Columbian Exchange, which begins this process of Europe basically expanding European possessions to non-European places. On the other hand, we see sort of a decline in Islamic empires throughout southwestern and Central Asia. But in Russia, we have a really interesting development, and that is Russia expands as a traditional land power. And when I mean it expands, it basically starts the period here and ends the period with all of this. So basically, within about 2.5 centuries, Russia manages to, I don't know, like quintuple, septuple in size, something like that. Russia is by far the largest country on planet Earth. If you live in some parts of Alaska, I've heard that you can see Russia from your house. That being said, if you look at where Russians actually live, you're not going to find like a ton of people hanging out in Siberia. If you look at where Russians live or lived, both in the 14 to 1500s or even today, you're going to find that they live disproportionately in the western part of the country. And arguably, that's where they've always lived, going all the way back to the Duchy of Muscovy. So remember, in the last unit, Russia wasn't really a thing. It was a series of autonomous, in other words, sovereign, city-states, kingdoms, and duchies, like, for example, the Duchy of Muscovy or Kievan Rus. And they were eventually, for the most part, all conquered by the Golden Horde led by Ogadei Khan. Now, we also talked about the fact that Moscow kind of emerges as a leading vassal amongst the Russian states. Now, the way that Moscow makes it happen is that Moscow basically tells the leadership of the Golden Horde that taking taxes from people is a lot of work. It takes a lot of administrative overhead. No one really wants to do it, so just let them take tax revenue and pay it to the Mongol overlords. But remember that the Duchy of Muscovy was skimming money off the top. Also, if people failed to pay their taxes or protection money, remember the Duchy of Muscovy had the right to basically go and confiscate their territory. So the Duchy of Muscovy was literally growing stronger while feeding off the Mongol Empire until finally the duchy manages to raise an army and they overthrow the Golden Horde. Ivan III was the first Russian ruler to refuse to pay tribute to the Mongols. A lot more on him later. But the Russians basically emerge from this period really isolated from the rest of the world, and especially isolated from Europe. Whereas remember that the people who first really settled Russia, or at least founded large permanent states in Russia, like Kievan Rus, specifically we're talking about the Rus people, they were there primarily to trade and establish those trading connections. And paradoxically, those sort of floundered under the Mongol Empire, and trading is kind of what the Mongols were supposed to be especially good at. So there's an argument that it sort of reduces the vitality of Russian culture. And also because of its isolation, trade and manufacturing was sort of limited. And so you have essentially an economy that's purely based on agriculture and peasant labor. Sensing weakness, Ivan III continues to expand, but he does so through the military aid of a group called the Cossacks. So, who were the Cossacks? Well, they were people who were semi-nomadic, who were exceptionally good at riding horses, and were highly militarized. What's that? You in the back? Are you asking if the Russians basically utilize Mongols to fight Mongols? No. These are Cossacks. not like Mongols whatsoever. Yeah, the fact is that the Duchy of Muscovy sort of copy pastes what makes the Mongol Empire successful, at least on a military level. And so you kind of have this system of military feudalism in which Cossacks are going to protect and expand the Russian frontier, and in exchange, these Cossacks are given lots of additional freedoms, unlike serfs. It's also interesting to note that the Cossacks are not one people. Most of them are Eastern Slavs, but you also have Cossacks from a variety of different language groups. So, and also there are still millions of Cossacks alive today. This also means that Russia becomes increasingly diverse. By the way, I'm going to be using Muscovy, Moscow, and Russia sort of interchangeably here because eventually you're going to find out that they all essentially mean the same thing. But now Russia, which has always sort of seen itself as an Orthodox state since the days of Kievan Rus, now you're starting to see the inclusion of a large Muslim population from Central Asia. And by the way, that's only going to increase as time goes on. But Russia also kind of creates a system not unlike what we see in Imperial Rome or the United States under Manifest Destiny, where expansion kind of leads to expansion. So the czars would give nobles and bureaucrats new estates on land that was conquered, which means that for the most part, as long as the land was non-crappy, there's always this demand for more and more acquisitions. And also, this is not just something that benefited the nobles and bureaucrats. It also benefited, for example, the Cossacks, who were basically allowed to keep the land that they settled, and they were also, basically free from serfdom. So let's talk about the two leaders you absolutely have to know from this period: Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, and then Ivan IV, aka Ivan the Terrible, aka a guy who's cosplaying Emperor Ming the Merciless from Flash Gordon. Okay, so Ivan the Great. We've already talked about him as the guy who basically overthrows Mongol control. That would make him historically significant, just in general. But he also establishes a couple of really essential elements of the Russian state. So, firstly, he declares himself Tsar, and this is basically a transliteration of the word Caesar into Russian. And this is sort of in keeping with the idea that Russia adopts for itself as being the inheritor of the traditions of Rome. So, the idea is that you had the Roman Empire, then with the fall of the Western Empire, you had the Eastern Empire, and then with the fall of the Eastern Empire, Russia adopts the mantle of basically being the last vestige of the Roman Empire. And it adopts things like the double eagle crest, which was basically using the Eastern Roman Empire as basically its official sort of royal coat of arms, that kind of thing. So the idea of Russia being a successor to the Roman Empire is something that we see again and again. If you're a successor to the Roman Empire, then you probably want the Roman Empire stuff. So what that's also going to mean is that the Russian Empire has this kind of fixation with the city of Constantinople, and it's very protective over it. So this also means that the Russian Empire is going to be put on a collision course with the Ottoman Empire that kind of runs Constantinople right now. By the way, just like in the Eastern Roman Empire, you have the assertion of control over all Orthodox churches, so a little bit of Caesaropapism there. You guys know that's my favorite word ever. Then Ivan III kicks the bucket, but he manages to have, I think, the second longest reign of any Russian czar, ruling for about 43 years, so, pretty respectable. The throne is taken by his grandson, Ivan IV, aka Ivan the Terrible. And was Ivan the Terrible actually terrible? Yes. But in Russia, or rather in Russian, the word terrible, grozny, actually doesn't translate well into English. Terrible in English just means that, like awful, disgusting, whatever. In Russian, something being terrible is also used to describe something being awe-inspiring or frightening. So, and Ivan was both terrible in the traditional sense and also terrible in the awe-inspiring sense. So, what we kind of associate Ivan the Fourth with is going after the remnants of the Golden Horde. Basically, their descendants were called the Tartars, and so he basically starts attacking them with armies increasingly based around new gunpowder technology. So he begins to push into Siberia. Eventually, this is going to lead to Russia, the new Russian Empire, spanning over 1 billion acres, which eventually leads to Russia becoming a world power because of all of these resources, that many of which have still not been really tapped into today. Now, a lot of that expansion requires constant help by this class of aristocracy called the boyars. You can kind of think of them as basically like the European lords or knights, just in Russia. And finally, you also have increased need for the Cossacks that will come and basically settle land occupied by the Russian state. Now, Russia is a pretty big place, and the Tsar is just one guy. It's not like he can constantly ride around and sort of check up on everybody. And you've got nobles, and we know that nobles never scheme to overthrow the state. So to basically fix that potential problem, you have the granddaddy of KGB, the Oprichny. The Oprichniki are a bodyguard corps and a unit of spies that are basically designed to make sure that the Russian nobles stay nice and quiet.
Hey guys,
it's Emily and Hannah.
Right, guys. Make sure you guys are taking your notes.
Yeah, guys,
Okay.
you need to take your notes or else we're going to fail all of the tests and the quizzes.
Okay, this is your reminder to take the notes.
Exactly.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Or else Ivan the Terrible will get you.
Exactly.
Now, there's only one fly in the ointment for Ivan. So, that's the story of the two Ivans. Next time we'll talk about people who like to build cities in swamps.